The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty military compound as Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. Her hands, steady despite the trembling in her chest, had held this same weapon through 18 months of deployment. But today was different. Today, she wasn't here as a soldier on patrol or a sniper providing cover for advancing troops. Today, she had come to visit her younger brother Tommy, stationed just 2 miles away at Forward Operating Base Alpha. What started as a simple family reunion in a war zone would become the longest day of her life. In less than 4 hours, Sarah would make a decision that would save dozens of lives, change the course of a major battle, and forever alter how she saw herself as both a sister and a soldier. The enemy had been watching, waiting, and planning. They knew about the family visit. They knew about the weakened defenses. They knew everything except one crucial detail. Sarah Martinez was one of the most lethal snipers in her unit, and when cornered, she became something far more dangerous than they had ever encountered. This is the story of how a routine family visit became a fight for survival, and how one woman's protective instincts transformed her from a visitor into the most important person on the battlefield. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as the armored vehicle came to a stop outside Forward Operating Base Alpha. The desert heat was already unbearable at 9 in the morning, and the heavy tactical gear didn't make things any easier. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. After months of dangerous missions and sleepless nights, she finally had permission to visit her younger brother Tommy, who was stationed at this smaller outpost just 2 miles from her main base. The drive had been routine, escorted by 2 other vehicles through what intelligence reports called a relatively secure corridor. Sarah knew better than to trust those reports completely. In her 18 months of deployment, she had learned that nowhere was truly safe in this region. Every road could hide an improvised explosive device, every building could shelter enemy fighters, and every moment of peace could be shattered by gunfire. As she stepped out of the vehicle, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and worry. Tommy was only 19, barely out of basic training when he arrived in country 3 months ago. She had tried to talk him out of enlisting, especially after she had already committed to military service. The idea of both siblings serving in the same dangerous region kept their parents awake at night. But Tommy was stubborn, just like their father had been before his own military service in Vietnam. The base was smaller than Sarah had expected. Where her main compound housed nearly 300 soldiers, this forward position held maybe 60 troops. The perimeter walls were lower, the guard towers fewer, and the overall feeling was more intimate but also more vulnerable. She could see why Command had chosen this location, though. It sat on elevated ground with clear sight lines in 3 directions, perfect for monitoring enemy movement through the valley below. "Martinez! Sarah Martinez!" Tommy's voice called out from across the small courtyard. Sarah turned to see her little brother jogging toward her, his face breaking into the same grin he'd worn since childhood. Despite the military haircut and the desert camouflage uniform, he still looked like the kid who used to follow her around their neighborhood in Texas, asking endless questions about everything. They hugged briefly, both conscious of the other soldiers watching, and the informal protocol that discouraged too much emotion during duty hours. But Sarah could feel the relief in Tommy's embrace. She knew he had been struggling with the isolation and responsibility of his first deployment. His letters home had started cheerful but gradually revealed the weight of constant vigilance and the fear that came with being so far from family. "How's Mom taking it, having both of us over here?" Tommy asked as they walked toward the mess tent. Sarah noticed he kept his rifle ready and his eyes moving, habits that showed he was adapting well to the environment despite his youth. "About as well as you'd expect," Sarah replied. "She lights a candle every night and keeps both our pictures on the kitchen table." Dad pretends he's not worried, but I caught him reading casualty reports online during my last phone call home. They found a quiet spot in the mess tent where Sarah could see the entire room while keeping her back to a solid wall. Even during family visits, her training never switched off. She had been a sniper for 2 years before this deployment, selected for her steady hands, sharp eyes, and ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Those skills had kept her alive through 17 confirmed combat engagements. Tommy updated her on his unit's recent activities. They had been conducting patrols through nearby villages, establishing relationships with local leaders, and gathering intelligence on enemy movements. It was important work, but relatively low risk compared to Sarah's missions, which often involved providing overwatch for dangerous raids deep in hostile territory. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when we get home," Tommy said, picking at his meal. "Maybe use the GI Bill for college. Study engineering like Dad always wanted one of us to do." Sarah smiled. That sounds good, Tommy. You're smart enough to do anything you want. She paused, watching his face. Are you doing okay out here? Really okay? Tommy's expression grew more serious. Some days are harder than others. Last week we lost radio contact with a patrol for 6 hours. Turned out to be equipment failure, but those 6 hours felt like 6 years. And the guys here, they're good soldiers, but they're not family, you know? Sarah understood completely. The bonds formed between soldiers in combat were strong, but they were different from the connections you had with people who knew you before you put on the uniform. Military life could be isolating, especially for someone as young as Tommy. They spent the next hour talking about home, sharing stories from their respective units, and catching up on family news. Sarah told them about their cousin's wedding, which they would both miss, and about how their grandfather's health was improving after his heart surgery. These normal family conversations felt precious in the harsh environment of the military base. Around 11 o'clock, the base commander, Major Williams, approached their table. Sarah stood and saluted, but the major waved her back to her seat. Sergeant Martinez, I've heard good things about your work, Major Williams said. Your reputation as a marksman has reached us even out here. I was wondering if you might be willing to help us with a small training exercise this afternoon. Some of our newer soldiers could benefit from observing proper sniper techniques. Sarah glanced at Tommy, who nodded encouragingly. I'd be happy to help, sir. What did you have in mind?
Nothing too elaborate.
Maybe a demonstration of long-range shooting and target identification. We've set up a range about half a mile south of the base where we conduct marksmanship training. Would 2 o'clock work for you? Sarah agreed, pleased to have something productive to do during her visit. Teaching other soldiers was something she enjoyed, and it would give her a chance to stay sharp while spending time with Tommy's unit. She had planned to stay until the next morning before returning to her base, so there was plenty of time for both the training exercise and more family conversation. After Major Williams left, Tommy looked excited. The guys are going to love this. We've heard stories about some of the shots you've made, but seeing you work will be incredible. Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. Her shooting skills had saved lives and completed missions, but she never enjoyed the attention that came with her reputation. She preferred to think of herself as a professional doing necessary work rather than as some kind of legendary figure. As they finished lunch, Sarah noticed increased radio chatter from the communications tent. Several soldiers were moving with more urgency than she had observed earlier, and she saw the base's senior NCO having an intense conversation with Major Williams near the command post.
Everything okay?
She asked Tommy. Tommy looked around and shrugged. Probably just routine stuff. We get a lot of false alarms out here. Intelligence reports, possible threats that turn out to be nothing. Major Williams is careful about security, which is good for all of us. But Sarah's instincts, honed by months of combat experience, were telling her something different. The pattern of activity reminded her of the preparations her own base made when expecting trouble. Soldiers were checking weapons, radio operators were testing frequencies, and the atmosphere had shifted from relaxed to alert. She decided not to worry Tommy unnecessarily. If there was a real threat, the officers would handle it according to protocol. Her job today was to be a visiting sister, not a tactical analyst. Still, she made a mental note to keep her own weapon ready and her situational awareness high. At 1:30, Sarah and Tommy walked toward the designated training area. The shooting range was positioned on a ridge that overlooked the valley, providing excellent visibility and natural cover. Sarah carried her rifle, a custom-modified weapon that she had personally zeroed and maintained throughout her deployment. The familiar weight of it in her hands was comforting. Several soldiers from Tommy's unit had gathered to watch the demonstration. Sarah could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their faces. Some of them probably thought the stories about her abilities were exaggerated. She didn't mind proving herself. It came with the territory of being a female sniper in a predominantly male environment. All right, everyone gather around, she called out as she began setting up her equipment. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of long-range shooting, then move on to some practical exercises. As she spoke, explaining breathing techniques and trigger control, Sarah felt at home. This was what she did best, and sharing that knowledge with other soldiers gave her a sense of purpose beyond the immediate demands of combat. Teaching was a way of multiplying her effectiveness, potentially saving lives she would never know about. But even as she focused on the training exercise, part of her mind remained alert to the sounds and movements around the base. Her survival instincts never fully relaxed, even during peaceful moments like this. That vigilance had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous situations, and she wasn't about to abandon it now, even while visiting her brother. The first part of her demonstration went smoothly. She showed the soldiers how to properly adjust their scopes, how to account for wind and elevation, and how to maintain steady positioning during extended observation periods. Tommy watched with obvious pride, and the other soldiers seemed genuinely impressed by her expertise and professionalism. None of them knew that in less than 2 hours, everything would change, and Sarah's visit would become the most important day in the history of Forward Operating Base Alpha. The first shot came at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, according to Sarah's watch. She was in the middle of explaining proper breathing techniques when the sharp crack of a rifle echoed across the valley. The sound was wrong, too close and coming from the wrong direction to be part of any scheduled exercise. Sarah immediately dropped into a prone position behind the concrete barrier that served as the shooting platform. Her training kicked in automatically, her body reacting faster than her conscious mind could process what was happening. Around her, the soldiers from Tommy's unit looked confused for a split second before their own training took over. "Contact north," someone shouted from the direction of the main base. Sarah could hear the distinctive rattle of automatic weapons fire, both friendly and hostile. The sounds were coming from multiple directions, which meant this wasn't a random sniper attack or a small probing action. This was a coordinated assault. Tommy dropped down beside her, his face pale but his hands steady as he checked his rifle. "Sarah, what's happening?" "We're under attack," she replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Multiple shooters. Probably been planning this for a while." She raised her head slightly to scan the area beyond the shooting range. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes coming from 3 different positions in the rocky hills that surrounded the base. The shooting range where they had gathered for training was about 300 yards south of the main base, connected by a dirt road and offering a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Sarah realized they were in an exposed position, but also one that provided excellent fields of fire if they could establish defensive positions. "Martinez!" Major Williams' voice crackled through Tommy's radio. "What's your status at the range?" Tommy keyed his microphone. "We have 8 personnel at the training site, including Sergeant Martinez. We're taking fire from multiple positions, but no casualties yet." "Roger. Hold your position and establish overwatch. We have approximately 30 hostiles attacking from the north and east. Unknown number approaching from other directions. This appears to be a coordinated attack on the base." Sarah was already studying the terrain through her scope, identifying the enemy positions and calculating ranges. Her mind shifted into what she called sniper mode, a state of focused calm where everything except the immediate tactical situation faded away. This was what she had been trained for, what she was good at. "Tommy, get the men spread out behind this barrier. Make sure everyone has good cover and overlapping fields of fire. I need to find their spotters." In any coordinated attack like this, the enemy would have forward observers calling in targeting information and coordinating the assault. Finding and eliminating those spotters would disrupt their communications and reduce the effectiveness of their attack. Sarah began systematically scanning the high ground, looking for the telltale glint of optics or the subtle movement that would reveal concealed positions. She found the first one almost immediately, about 800 yards to the northeast, partially concealed behind a cluster of rocks. A man was using binoculars to observe the base and directing fire through a handheld radio. Sarah estimated the range, adjusted for the slight crosswind, and controlled her breathing. The shot felt perfect the moment she pulled the trigger. Through her scope, she watched the spotter collapse backward, his radio clattering down the rocky slope. Almost immediately, the intensity of fire from that direction decreased as the enemy fighters lost their coordination. "One down," she reported to Tommy. "Keep everyone low while I find the others." The second spotter was harder to locate. Sarah spent precious minutes scanning the western hills before catching a brief movement behind a low stone wall about 600 yards away. This shooter was more experienced, exposing himself for only seconds at a time while calling in targeting information. Sarah waited patiently, controlling her breathing and keeping her crosshairs steady on the spot where she expected him to reappear. When he finally raised his head for another observation, she was ready. The second shot was just as clean as the first. Meanwhile, the battle for the main base was intensifying. Sarah could hear the deep thump of mortars being fired, followed by explosions somewhere behind them. The enemy had brought more than just rifles to this fight. Radio chatter indicated that the base's perimeter had been breached in 2 locations, and close-quarters fighting was taking place near the motor pool. "Sarah, they're asking for covering fire on the north wall," Tommy said, monitoring multiple radio frequencies. "Our guys are pinned down and can't move to reinforce the breach." Sarah shifted her position to get a better angle on the northern approach to the base. Through her scope, she could see at least a dozen enemy fighters advancing through a drainage ditch that provided them cover from the base's defensive positions. They were moving in coordinated bounds, with some providing covering fire while others advanced. These were experienced fighters, not the usual hastily organized insurgent group. The range was just over 400 yards, well within her effective zone. Sarah began engaging targets methodically, starting with the fighters carrying what appeared to be heavy weapons. Each shot was carefully aimed and deliberate. She wasn't trying to stop the entire assault by herself, but rather to disrupt their coordination and buy time for the base defenders to reorganize. After her fifth confirmed hit, the enemy fighters in the drainage ditch became aware they were being engaged by a sniper. Sarah watched them begin looking around frantically, trying to identify her position. A few of them fired wildly in her general direction, but they were too far away and shooting uphill to be accurate. "Tommy, we need to relocate soon," she said, already planning their next position. "They'll start concentrating fire on this area once they figure out where I'm shooting from." But even as she prepared to move, Sarah realized something that made her stomach tighten with worry. The pattern of the attack, the timing, the coordination, it all suggested that the enemy had detailed intelligence about the base's defenses and routines. This wasn't a random assault. Someone had provided them with specific information about guard rotations, defensive positions, and weak points in the perimeter. More troubling was the timing. Sarah's visit had been planned for weeks, but the details of her schedule had only been finalized 2 days ago. The enemy's decision to attack today, when the base had a visiting sniper who could provide additional defensive firepower, seemed like either incredibly bad luck or evidence that their intelligence network was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Through her scope, Sarah continued engaging targets while her mind raced through the implications. If the enemy had inside information, they would know about the base's limited ammunition supplies, the locations of key defensive positions, and the fact that the nearest reinforcements were at least 30 minutes away by helicopter. "Martinez, this is Major Williams." The radio crackled. "We're holding the perimeter but taking heavy casualties. Can you provide continuous overwatch from your position?" "Roger, Major. I have good fields of fire from here, but we'll need to displace soon. The enemy is starting to bracket our location with mortar fire." As if summoned by her words, the first mortar round landed 50 yards to their left, sending up a shower of dirt and rocks. Sarah felt the pressure wave wash over them, and her ears rang from the explosion. The enemy had indeed located their position and was beginning to concentrate fire on the shooting range. "Everyone move to the alternate position," Sarah shouted to the soldiers around her. They had identified a secondary location about 100 yards east that offered similar fields of fire, but would be harder for the enemy to target. As they bounded from cover to cover, carrying their weapons and essential equipment, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. In the distance, beyond the immediate battle area, she could see dust clouds that suggested vehicles approaching from the south. Either reinforcements were arriving much faster than expected, or the enemy had additional forces that were about to enter the fight. She keyed her radio as they reached the new position. "Major Williams, I have possible vehicle movement approaching from the south. Distance approximately 2 miles and closing. Negative on friendly reinforcements from that direction, Martinez. Assume hostile until confirmed otherwise." Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat. If those were additional enemy forces, the small base was about to be outnumbered by an even wider margin. The attack was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, and Sarah was beginning to understand that her family visit had inadvertently placed her at the center of what might become a major battle. Through her scope, she began counting vehicles in the approaching dust cloud, at least 6, possibly 8, which could mean anywhere from 30 to 60 additional enemy fighters. The timing of their arrival suggested careful coordination with the ongoing assault. This wasn't a spontaneous attack, it was a well-planned operation, designed to overwhelm the base's defenses through superior numbers and multiple axes of attack. Tommy was monitoring radio traffic and keeping track of the base's defensive situation. "Sarah, they're reporting ammunition running low at the north wall. Major Williams is asking if you can provide precision fire support to help them fall back to secondary positions." Sarah nodded, already identifying priority targets. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and she was no longer just a visiting sister. She was now one of the most important defensive assets the base had, and the lives of everyone inside the perimeter, including her younger brother, might depend on her ability to use her rifle effectively in the minutes ahead. The vehicles were getting closer, and Sarah could see that some of them mounted heavy weapons. The small base was about to face its greatest test, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice to protect the people she cared about. The convoy of enemy vehicles reached the valley floor just as Sarah was settling into her new firing position. Through her scope, she could see them spreading out in a tactical formation that spoke of military training and experience. These weren't typical insurgent fighters driving whatever vehicles they could find. These men had proper tactical vehicles, coordinated communications, and the discipline to execute complex maneuvers under fire. Sarah counted 8 vehicles total, 4 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, 2 larger trucks that appeared to be carrying troops, and 2 smaller scout vehicles racing ahead to establish observation positions. Conservative estimates put the enemy force at over 60 fighters, merely matching the total number of defenders at Forward Operating Base Alpha. "Tommy, get Major Williams on the radio," Sarah said, not taking her eye away from the scope. "Tell him the southern approach has 8 vehicles with heavy weapons. They're going to try to establish a base of fire about 1,000 yards out and then send dismounted troops to flank our position." As Tommy relayed the information, Sarah began calculating ranges and wind corrections for the longer shots she would need to take. The approaching vehicles were still beyond the effective range of most of the base's small arms, but well within her capability. She would have to prioritize targets carefully, focusing on the vehicles with the heaviest weapons and the most tactical importance. The lead scout vehicle was moving fast across the rocky terrain, its driver clearly experienced in desert navigation. Sarah led the target, accounting for its speed and the ballistic drop of her bullet over the 800-yard distance. Her first shot struck the vehicle's front tire, sending it into a violent roll that scattered debris across a 50-yard radius. The second scout vehicle immediately changed direction, weaving unpredictably as its driver realized they were under sniper fire. Sarah waited patiently, knowing that the terrain would eventually force the vehicle into a predictable path. When it slowed to navigate around a cluster of large rocks, she put her next shot through the windshield. Behind her, the sounds of battle from the main base were growing more intense. Machine gun fire rattled continuously, punctuated by the explosions of grenades and the heavier thump of mortars. Radio chatter indicated that enemy fighters had breached the perimeter in 3 locations and were engaging in close-quarters combat throughout the compound. "Sarah, they're asking for you to engage the heavy weapons on those trucks," Tommy said, his voice tight with stress. "The base doesn't have anything that can reach them at that range." Sarah was already shifting her aim toward the nearest truck-mounted machine gun. The weapon appeared to be a Russian-made heavy machine gun, capable of penetrating the base's concrete barriers and suppressing multiple defensive positions simultaneously. Eliminating the crew operating that weapon would significantly reduce the enemy's ability to provide covering fire for their ground assault. The gunner was partially protected by a steel shield, but Sarah could see enough of his profile to make an accurate shot. At nearly 900 yards, with a slight crosswind, it was one of the more challenging shots she had attempted during the deployment. She controlled her breathing, allowed for wind drift, and squeezed the trigger during the natural pause between heartbeats. Through her scope, she watched the gunner collapse backward off the truck bed. The heavy machine gun fell silent, its barrel pointing skyward at an odd angle. Almost immediately, another fighter climbed up to take the fallen gunner's position, but Sarah was ready for him too. "2 down on the heavy gun," she reported, "but they have backup crews." The enemy was adapting to her presence faster than she had hoped. After losing 3 vehicles and 2 machine gun crews, the remaining vehicles spread out into a wider formation and began using smoke grenades to obscure their positions. Sarah could still see movement through the smoke, but her target identification became much more difficult. Meanwhile, the original assault on the base was reaching a critical point. Radio reports indicated that enemy fighters had captured the motor pool and were advancing toward the command post. Ammunition supplies were running critically low, and several key defensive positions had been abandoned under heavy fire. "Martinez, this is Williams," the major's voice came through the radio, punctuated by nearby gunfire. "We're falling back to the inner perimeter. I need you to provide covering fire for our withdrawal from the north wall. We have wounded who can't move fast." Sarah shifted her position to get a clear view of the base's northern defensive positions. Through her scope, she could see American soldiers moving between buildings under heavy fire, some carrying wounded comrades. Enemy fighters were pursuing them aggressively, trying to prevent an organized withdrawal to more defensible positions. She began engaging targets systematically, prioritizing enemy fighters who were in positions to cut off the American retreat routes. Each shot had to count, both because ammunition was limited and because every enemy fighter she didn't stop would continue threatening the withdrawing Americans. At 400 yards, Sarah could see the individual faces of the enemy fighters through her scope. Most appeared young, probably in their 20s, with the lean, weathered look of men who had spent years fighting in the desert. They moved with confidence and coordination, covering each other's movements and communicating through hand signals when radio communication was impossible. Sarah forced herself to focus on the tactical situation rather than thinking about the human cost of what she was doing. These men were trying to kill her brother and the other soldiers she had shared lunch with just hours earlier. Every shot she took potentially saved American lives. Her seventh shot of this engagement took down an enemy fighter who was setting up what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher in a position that would have threatened the command post. Her eighth shot eliminated a sniper who had been targeting the American medics trying to reach wounded soldiers. "Good shooting, Martinez," Major Williams reported. "You've given us the time we needed to establish the inner perimeter, but I need to warn you, we're picking up radio chatter suggesting they have additional reinforcements coming from the east. This fight is far from over." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning the eastern approach to the valley. The terrain in that direction was more rugged, with deep wadis and rocky outcroppings that would provide excellent concealment for approaching forces. If more enemy fighters were coming from that direction, she might not see them until they were much closer to the base. The vehicles that had approached from the south were now in prepared positions, their heavy weapons providing continuous fire against the base's defenses. Sarah could see that they had established a coordinated base of fire with overlapping fields of view that would make it extremely dangerous for anyone to move openly around the compound. "Tommy, how's our ammunition situation?" she asked while continuing to scan for targets. Tommy checked the supplies they had brought to the shooting range. "We have maybe 40 rounds left for your rifle, plus whatever's in the magazines for our personal weapons. Not much for extended fight." Sarah nodded grimly. 40 rounds wouldn't last long if the battle continued at its current pace. She would need to be even more selective with her targets, focusing on enemy fighters whose elimination would have the greatest tactical impact. Through her scope, she watched enemy fighters beginning to maneuver around the base's flanks, using the cover provided by their heavy weapons to advance to closer positions. The base's defenders were now completely surrounded, with enemy forces in established positions to the north, east, south, and west. But Sarah also noticed something that gave her hope. The enemy's movements were becoming less coordinated as they lost their forward observers and key leaders to her sniper fire. Small groups of fighters were advancing without proper support, making individual decisions rather than following a unified plan. "Major Williams, I think their command structure is breaking down," she reported. "I've been targeting their leaders and radio operators, and their movements are becoming more disorganized." "Roger that, Martinez. Keep up the pressure. Our reinforcements are still 30 minutes out, but if we can hold the inner perimeter until then, we might make it through this." Sarah settled in for what she knew would be the longest and most important 30 minutes of her military career. The enemy was regrouping for what appeared to be a final assault on the base's inner defenses, and she was one of the few assets that could engage them at long range before they reached the perimeter. As she prepared for the next phase of the battle, Sarah thought briefly about the irony of her situation. She had come here to visit her brother and escape the stress of combat operations. Instead, she had found herself at the center of the largest and most dangerous battle Forward Operating Base Alpha had ever faced. But there was no time for reflection. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters beginning to move towards assault positions, and the radio was reporting movement from multiple directions. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how much difference one skilled sniper could make in determining the outcome of a desperate fight. The enemy's final assault began at exactly 4:15 p.m., with a coordinated mortar barrage that shook the ground beneath Sarah's position. 12 rounds fell within the base perimeter in rapid succession, targeting the command post, communications equipment, and known defensive positions. The accuracy of the fire confirmed Sarah's suspicion that the attackers had detailed intelligence about the base layout. Through her scope, Sarah watched enemy fighters beginning their advance from 3 directions simultaneously. The coordination was impressive and terrifying. These weren't desperate fighters making a last-ditch effort. They were executing a carefully planned assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through synchronized pressure from multiple points. "Tommy, get everyone ready to displace again," Sarah said, already identifying their next firing position. "They're going to saturate this area with indirect fire once their assault teams get closer." From the south, approximately 30 fighters were advancing in a staggered formation that made it difficult to engage them effectively. They moved in short bounds, with half the force providing covering fire while the others advanced. Sarah could see they had learned from the earlier casualties and were being much more careful about exposing themselves to sniper fire. The northern assault was even larger, with what appeared to be 40 fighters advancing through the same drainage system Sarah had engaged earlier. They had brought portable cover in the form of metal shields and were using them effectively to limit her ability to engage individual targets. But it was the eastern approach that worried Sarah most. The terrain in that direction provided the most concealment, and she could only catch glimpses of movement between the rocky outcroppings. Intelligence estimates suggested at least 20 additional fighters were approaching from that direction, but Sarah couldn't get accurate counts or establish clear fields of fire. "Major Williams, this is Martinez," she radioed. "I count approximately 90 enemy fighters in 3 coordinated assault groups. They'll reach your perimeter in about 10 minutes. Copy that, Martinez. We're as ready as we can be with what we have left. Ammunition is critically low, but we'll make every shot count." Sarah began engaging the Southern Assault Group first, since they were advancing across the most open terrain. Her first shot dropped the apparent leader, a man carrying a radio and directing the movement of the other fighters. The effect was immediate. The advance slowed as the fighters looked around uncertainly, no longer sure of their specific objectives. Her second and third shots targeted fighters carrying what appeared to be demolition charges, probably intended to breach the base's inner defensive walls. Eliminating those charges would force the enemy to rely on small arms fire and grenades, significantly reducing their ability to break through hardened positions. But even as Sarah worked methodically through priority targets, she could see that the sheer number of attackers was going to overwhelm the base's defenders. There were simply too many enemy fighters advancing from too many directions for the small garrison to stop them all. Through her scope, she watched American soldiers in the base's defensive positions checking their ammunition and preparing for close-quarters combat. Many of them were down to their last few magazines. The heavy weapons that could have held off a large assault had already been disabled by enemy fire or abandoned due to lack of ammunition.
"Sarah, they're asking for immediate fire support on the northern drainage," Tommy reported, monitoring multiple radio frequencies. "The enemy is about to breach the outer perimeter there." Sarah shifted her aim toward the northern assault group. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters advancing within 50 yards of the base's defensive positions. American soldiers were throwing grenades and firing in short, controlled bursts, trying to make their remaining ammunition last as long as possible. She identified an enemy machine gun team that was providing covering fire for the advancing fighters and put her next shot through the gunner's center mass. The machine gun fell silent, and the enemy advance in that sector slowed momentarily, as fighters looked for cover. But Sarah knew she was fighting a losing battle. Even with perfect shot placement and unlimited ammunition, one sniper couldn't stop 90 determined attackers spread across a wide front. The best she could do was buy time and hope that reinforcements arrived before the base's defenses collapsed entirely. As if reading her thoughts, Major Williams came on the radio with an update that made Sarah's heart sink. "All units be advised that our reinforcement timeline has been pushed back. Heavy weather at the main base is grounding helicopter operations. We're now looking at 45 minutes minimum before help arrives." 45 minutes was an eternity in a close-quarters battle. Sarah looked at her remaining ammunition, less than 20 rounds, and realized that the mathematics of the situation were becoming impossible. She couldn't engage enough targets to make a decisive difference, and the base's defenders couldn't hold their positions much longer without resupply. It was then that Sarah noticed something that made her rethink her entire approach. The enemy vehicles that had established the base of fire positions were still actively engaged, their heavy weapons providing continuous suppression against the base's defenders. But their positioning, while tactically sound for supporting the ground assault, also made them vulnerable to flanking fire from Sarah's elevated position. More importantly, she could see fuel cans and ammunition boxes stacked near several of the vehicles. If she could ignite those supplies, the resulting explosions might disrupt the entire enemy operation, and by the time the base needed to survive until reinforcements arrived. "Tommy, I need you to take over target selection for the ground assault," Sarah said, handing him a set of binoculars. "Call out priority targets, and I'll engage them. But first, I'm going to try something that might change the whole dynamic of this fight." Sarah adjusted her scope for the longer shot to the enemy vehicle positions. The range was over 1,000 yards, at the extreme limit of her rifle's effective range, and she would need to hit small, specific targets to achieve the effect she was hoping for. Her first shot at the fuel cans missed, the bullet striking the ground just short of the target. Sarah adjusted for the longer range and tried again. Her second shot struck one of the fuel containers but failed to ignite it. She needed to hit something that would create sparks or sufficient heat to start a fire. It was her third shot that changed everything. The bullet struck a metal ammunition box at precisely the right angle, creating sparks that ignited fuel vapors from a nearby container. The explosion was immediate and devastating, engulfing 3 vehicles and sending a column of black smoke high into the desert air. The effect on the enemy assault was dramatic and immediate. Fighters throughout the battlefield turned to look at the explosion, many assuming they were under attack by aircraft or artillery. The coordinated advance faltered as unit leaders tried to re-establish communication and determine what had happened. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. With the enemy fighters momentarily confused and exposed, she began engaging targets rapidly.
no longer concerned about conserving ammunition. Her shots came in quick succession, each one carefully aimed but fired much faster than her usual deliberate pace. In less than 2 minutes, she eliminated 8 enemy fighters who had been caught in the open when their attention turned toward the burning vehicles. More importantly, she was able to target several more unit leaders and radio operators, further disrupting the enemy's command and control. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Major Williams called over the radio. "That explosion has them completely confused. We're using the opportunity to reposition and consolidate our defenses." But Sarah knew the respite would be temporary. The enemy commanders would quickly realize what had happened and adapt their tactics accordingly. She had bought valuable time, but the fundamental problem remained. The base was still outnumbered and running out of ammunition. Through her scope, Sarah watched enemy fighters beginning to reorganize, this time with much more attention to maintaining cover and concealment. They had learned to respect her capabilities, but they hadn't given up their assault. If anything, the destruction of their vehicles had made them more determined to overrun the base quickly. "Tommy, how much ammunition do we have left?" 12 rounds for your rifle, maybe 30 rounds total for everyone else up here." Sarah nodded grimly. 12 rounds to stop what remained of a coordinated assault by approximately 70 enemy fighters. The mathematics were stark, but Sarah Martinez had never been one to give up when the odds were against her. As she prepared for what might be her final engagements of the battle, Sarah thought about her parents back home in Texas, lighting candles and praying for both their children serving in a dangerous place. She thought about Tommy, barely 19, and facing the possibility that his first deployment might also be his last. But mostly, she focused on her scope reticle and the enemy fighters moving toward her brother's position. She had 12 bullets left, and she was going to make every one of them count in ways that would give the base's defenders the best possible chance of surviving until help arrived. Sarah Martinez had never felt the weight of individual bullets the way she did in that moment. 12 rounds remaining, and each one would need to count for more than just a single enemy fighter. She needed shots that would break enemy morale, disrupt their remaining coordination, and buy enough time for miracle reinforcements to arrive. The reorganized enemy assault was now approaching from 2 main directions, having abandoned their eastern approach after losing too many fighters to accurate rifle fire. About 40 fighters were advancing from the north, using a series of irrigation ditches and stone walls for cover. Another 30 were coming from the south, moving more cautiously after witnessing the vehicle explosion. Through her scope, Sarah studied the enemy formations, looking for the shots that would have maximum impact. She could see that both assault groups were being led by individuals carrying radios and directing the movements of the other fighters. These were the targets that would cause the most disruption if eliminated. "Tony, in about 30 seconds, I need you and the others to provide covering fire toward the northern group," Sarah said, settling into her final firing position. "I don't need you to hit anything specific, just make noise and muzzle flashes to draw their attention while I engage their leadership." Sarah's first shot of this final phase took down the radio operator directing the northern assault. The man had been crouched behind a low stone wall, partially concealed but visible enough for Sarah to put her bullet precisely where it needed to go. Through her scope, she watched the radio fall from his hands and bounce down a small slope, taking with it the enemy's ability to coordinate their attack. Her second shot targeted what appeared to be a senior leader in the southern group, a man who had been moving between fighting positions and giving instructions to the other attackers. This shot was more difficult, taken at over 700 yards against a target that was only briefly visible between patches of cover. The effect of losing their leadership was immediate and dramatic. Both assault groups slowed their advance and began looking around uncertainly. Without radio communication and clear direction, individual fighters began making their own tactical decisions, which quickly led to a breakdown in coordination. Sarah's third shot eliminated an enemy machine gunner who was providing covering fire for the northern advance. Her fourth shot took down a fighter who appeared to be trying to rally the southern group after the loss of their leader. But even as Sarah worked through her remaining ammunition, she could see that the enemy fighters were adapting to the situation. Small groups were beginning to advance independently, no longer waiting for coordinated signals. They might have lost their overall coordination, but they still significantly outnumbered the base's defenders. "Martinez, this is Williams," the radio crackled. "We're picking up radio chatter suggesting the enemy has called for additional reinforcements. We might be looking at a second wave if we can't finish this soon." Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat. A second wave would be catastrophic for the small base. They had barely survived the first assault, and only because of the disruption caused by her long-range fire. If fresh enemy fighters arrived while the defenders were exhausted and out of ammunition, forward operating base Alpha would be overrun within minutes.
She forced herself to focus on the immediate situation. 8 rounds remaining and approximately 60 enemy fighters still capable of continuing the assault. Sarah began engaging targets based purely on their threat to the base's survival, prioritizing fighters who were closest to breaching the perimeter or carrying weapons that could penetrate the defender's cover. Her 5th shot dropped an enemy fighter who had advanced to within 30 yards of the base's northern wall and was preparing to throw a satchel charge that would have blown a large hole in the defenses. Her 6th shot eliminated a sniper who had been engaging American positions from a church bell tower about 500 yards away. As Sarah lined up her 7th shot, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope that reinforcements had arrived earlier than expected. But the sound was wrong, too heavy, and coming from the wrong direction. Through her scope, she could see dust clouds approaching from the northwest, indicating the arrival of additional enemy forces just as Major Williams had warned. Sarah counted at least 4 more vehicles, which could mean 20 to 30 fresh fighters entering the battle. "Major, the second wave is arriving from the northwest," she reported. "I count 4 vehicles, probably 30 additional hostiles." "Copy that, Martinez. We'll do what we can, but we're running on empty here. Make those last few shots count." Sarah's 7th shot targeted the driver of the lead vehicle in the approaching convoy. At over 800 yards, and with the target moving at high speed across rough terrain, it was one of the most difficult shots she had ever attempted. The bullet struck the windshield slightly off-center, but caused the vehicle to veer sharply and roll over, blocking the path for the vehicles behind it. Her 8th shot took down an enemy fighter who had gotten close enough to the base perimeter to throw grenades into the defensive positions. Her 9th shot eliminated another radio operator who appeared to be trying to coordinate between the original assault force and the newly arrived reinforcements.
With 3 rounds remaining, Sarah faced an impossible choice.
She could continue engaging individual targets, buying a few more precious minutes for the base's defenders. Or she could attempt something far more risky but potentially decisive. The newly arrived vehicles had stopped to maneuver around their overturned lead vehicle, creating a cluster of targets around what appeared to be their command element. Sarah could see several individuals standing near the vehicles, pointing toward the base and apparently planning their assault. If she could disrupt this leadership group, the second wave might lose its coordination before it could effectively join the battle. Sarah aimed carefully at what appeared to be a fuel tank on one of the stopped vehicles. The shot would need to be perfect to achieve the ignition she was hoping for. At this range and with the stress of combat, the probability of success was low. But if it worked, the explosion might eliminate multiple vehicles and their crews in a single shot. Her 10th shot struck the fuel tank, but failed to ignite it. Sarah quickly adjusted her aim toward a different target. An ammunition box she could see in the back of one of the trucks. Her 11th shot created the spark she needed, igniting fuel vapors and ammunition in a massive explosion that engulfed 2 vehicles and sent debris flying in all directions. The explosion had effects far beyond the immediate casualties it caused. Enemy fighters throughout the battlefield paused their assault to stare at the column of smoke and flame rising from their reinforcement convoy. Many began retreating toward more distant positions, apparently concluding that they were under attack by aircraft or artillery. Sarah had 1 bullet remaining in her rifle, and the choice of how to use it would define the outcome of the battle. Through her scope, she could see that the enemy assault had lost most of its momentum. Many fighters were withdrawing to defensive positions, while others appeared to be arguing among themselves about whether to continue the attack. But there was still one threat that could reignite the assault. An individual who appeared to be a senior commander was moving between the scattered groups of enemy fighters, apparently trying to rally them for another coordinated push. If Sarah could eliminate this leader, the remaining enemy fighters might abandon their attack entirely. The target was approximately 600 yards away, partially concealed behind a concrete barrier and only occasionally visible as he moved between positions. Sarah would have one chance to take the shot that might end the battle. She controlled her breathing, adjusted for wind and distance, and waited for the perfect moment. When the enemy commander stepped into the open to signal to a group of fighters near the base perimeter, Sarah was ready. Her final shot was perfect. Through her scope, she watched the commander collapse. His radio falling silent, his ability to coordinate the assault eliminated forever. Within minutes, small groups of enemy fighters began withdrawing from their positions, no longer willing to continue an attack without clear leadership or support. "Martinez, this is Williams. I don't know how you did it, but the enemy appears to be withdrawing. We're seeing general movement away from our perimeter." As if summoned by the Major's transmission, the sound of friendly helicopter rotors finally reached Sarah's ears. 3 aircraft appeared on the horizon,
carrying the reinforcements that would secure forward operating base Alpha and ensure that the enemy's withdrawal became a permanent retreat. Tommy looked at his sister with a mixture of awe and pride. "Sarah, I think you just saved all of our lives." Sarah set down her rifle and looked around at the battlefield. Smoke was rising from multiple locations where her shots had found their mark. The base's defenders were emerging from their positions, tired and shaken but alive. Her younger brother was safe, along with dozens of other soldiers who might not have survived without her intervention. As the reinforcement helicopters began landing and fresh troops poured out to secure the area, Sarah reflected on the day that had begun as a simple family visit. She had fired 63 rounds, achieved 57 confirmed hits, and single-handedly disrupted the largest coordinated assault forward operating base Alpha had ever faced. But more than the statistics, Sarah thought about the letters she would write to the families of soldiers whose lives had been saved by her actions. She thought about Tommy's future, the college education he would now have the chance to pursue, and the stories they would someday tell their own children about this day in the desert.
Major Williams approached as the immediate security sweep was being completed.
"Sergeant Martinez, I've never seen shooting like that in 20 years of military service. You didn't just change the battle today, you won it single-handedly." Sarah nodded appreciatively, but kept her response simple. "Just doing my job, sir. Protecting my brother and his unit." As the sun began to set over the desert battlefield, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the smoke still rising from destroyed enemy vehicles, Sarah Martinez realized that her visit to forward operating base Alpha had become something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. She had arrived as a sister coming to check on her younger brother. She was leaving as the soldier who had fought against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious, proving that sometimes one person with the right skills and determination can change the course of history. The battle was over, but the story of what happened that day would be told and retold throughout the military for years to come. And somewhere in Texas, two parents would soon receive a phone call telling them that both their children were safe, and that their daughter had become a hero whose actions saved dozens of lives and demonstrated the very best of what it means to serve in uniform.